The day Matilda Finley arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas, the whole town stopped breathing, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she stepped off the stagecoach holding a rifle in one hand and a carpetbag in the other, and the expression on her face made it very clear she was not there to be saved by anyone. It was the spring of 1878, and the world west of the Mississippi was still very much a place where a woman traveling alone attracted a certain kind of dangerous attention. Matilda had already encountered two such men on the road from Abilene, a pair of drifters who had mistaken her calm demeanor for weakness and found out rather quickly that they were wrong. She had fired a warning shot between the boots of the taller one, and the two of them had scrambled off their horses and into the scrub without a single word of argument. She had continued the rest of the journey in blessed silence. Dusty Creek sat at the edge of the Texas Hill Country, a modest settlement of perhaps 200 souls gathered around a main street that consisted of a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a post office, a church, and the small land office where Matilda intended to register the deed her late father had left her. The deed was for 40 acres of grassland and a small homestead house that sat along Crane Creek, 3 miles south of town. Her father, James Finley, had acquired the land a decade before his death and had never managed to develop it, leaving it to Matilda in a will that also left her approximately nothing else of practical value except for the rifle, a good horse named Biscuit that had traveled tied to the back of the stagecoach, and a stubborn streak that could have rivaled the hill country limestone itself. She was 24 years old, she had nowhere else to go, and she was absolutely determined to make something of those 40 acres. The land office was closed by the time she arrived, so she led Biscuit to the livery and paid for his stall, then walked to the saloon because it was the only establishment still lit, and she needed to ask someone where a decent boarding house might be found. The saloon was called the Red Kettle, and it smelled like sawdust and whiskey, and something faintly like pine resin that she could not identify. A man behind the bar looked at her without particular surprise, which she appreciated. His name, she would later learn, was Pete Arroyo, and he ran the place with his wife Carmen, who cooked the best chili in 3 counties. Boarding house is Mrs. Holden's place on the north end, Pete said, polishing a glass. She does not rent to drinking men after dark, but she will take a woman traveling alone without any particular commentary. Tell her Pete sent you. Matilda thanked him and turned to leave, and that was when she walked directly into the chest of Clement Donovan. He was tall, though not unreasonably so, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that, at that particular moment, registered more surprise than anything else. He was wearing a duster that had seen considerable use, and a hat that had been through at least one rainstorm that she could tell by the way the brim sat. He caught her by the arms to keep her from stumbling, and for one fraction of a second they were close enough that she could smell trail dust and something like cedar soap. "Pardon me," he said immediately, stepping back and releasing her. "I was not looking where I was going." "Neither was I," she said, because it was only fair to admit it. She retrieved her carpetbag from where it had dropped and walked out the door. She did not think much about him that night. She had too many other things occupying her mind, including the state of the boarding room Mrs. Holden showed her, which was clean and small and had a window that looked out at a cottonwood tree, and the question of what exactly 40 acres of Texas grassland was going to require of her in order to become a working homestead. She had grown up on her father's small farm in Missouri before he had moved west, and she knew the basics of planting and livestock and water management, but she had never done it alone, and the isolation of it pressed at the back of her thoughts as she lay in the narrow bed and listened to the wind come down off the hills. She fell asleep eventually, and she dreamed of nothing in particular, and in the morning she went to the land office. The land office was run by a man named Bernard Keel, who had the energy of someone who had been sitting behind the same desk for 20 years and did not intend to stop. He reviewed her deed with a magnifying glass and a series of small sounds that could have meant anything, and then he looked up at her over his spectacles. "This deed is legitimate," he said. "Your father registered the original claim in 1868. The property taxes have been paid barely and late, but paid up through last year. You are the inheritor of record." He paused. "You are aware that there is a dispute." Matilda sat up straighter. What kind of dispute? It was not entirely a question. She had suspected something of the sort. Nothing her father had left her had ever been without complication. Bernard Keel explained that a man named Harlan Cross had been grazing cattle on the southern portion of her 40 acres for the past 2 years, apparently under the impression that the land had been abandoned and might eventually revert to open range. Cross was not a violent man, Bernard was quick to say, but he was a persistent one, and he had the resources of a mid-sized cattle operation behind him and a lawyer in San Antonio who wrote impressive letters. "The land is mine," Matilda said. "Legally registered, taxes paid." "Correct. Correct," Bernard said. "Then I will speak to Mr. Cross directly and make the situation clear to him." Bernard Keel looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted to suggest she proceed cautiously, but sensed that such a suggestion would not be well received. "You might also consider speaking to Clement Donovan," he said instead. "He is the closest thing this county has to a lawman at present. The county sheriff position has been vacant since January. Donovan is a former deputy out of Fort Worth who has been living on his own spread out east of town. He helps keep the peace when needed." Matilda was quiet for a moment. "Donovan," she said. "Yes, I believe you may have met him last evening, actually. He mentioned a woman had arrived on the stage." She filed the deed formally, accepted her copy of the registry stamp, and left. She found Clement Donovan at the livery stable, which seemed to be a place where half the town conducted its business. He was checking the shoe on a bay horse with the patient efficiency of someone who did it regularly. He looked up when she approached, and the recognition was immediate, followed by something that might have been amusement except that he was too careful to let it fully develop. "Miss Finley," he said. He set the horse's hoof down carefully. "Bernard Keel told me you might come by. Word travels fast," she said. In a town this size, word does not travel so much as it simply exists everywhere at once. He straightened and faced her properly. In the daylight she could see him more clearly than she had the previous night, and she noted that he was perhaps 30 or 31, with a careful quality to his face that suggested he thought before he spoke, which she respected. "I heard about the Cross situation. I was planning to ride out to your property this afternoon to have a look before you arrived there yourself." "I am capable of arriving at my own property," she said. "I know that," he said without any defensiveness. "I was planning to look at the fencing situation and the water access, not to protect you from Harlan Cross. He is more bluster than threat. But the creek has shifted since your father's deed was drawn, and there is a question about the northern boundary that you will want to understand before you set up any structures." This was a practical observation, and she could not argue with it. She looked at him for a moment, measuring. "Are you riding out today?" "This afternoon, yes." "Then I will ride with you," she said, "since it is my land." He nodded, as if this was the only sensible outcome. "I will meet you here at 2 o'clock. She spent the intervening hours at the general store, speaking with a woman named Agnes Drummond, who had been in Dusty Creek for 12 years and knew everything about the local terrain, the soil quality along Crane Creek, what grew and what did not, which neighbors were trustworthy and which were not. Agnes was perhaps 50, with gray streaks in her brown hair and an iron practical intelligence that Matilda immediately liked. "Clement Donovan is a good man," Agnes said, without Matilda having asked anything about him. She was wrapping dried beans in paper as she spoke. "He came here about 18 months ago from Fort Worth. There was some trouble there, nothing shameful, just a situation that went badly despite his best efforts, and he needed a fresh start. He has 40 acres of his own out east, runs a small herd, does some deputy work when the county needs it. He does not drink to excess, he does not involve himself in other people's business unless asked, and he keeps his word." "That is a considerable recommendation," Matilda said. Agnes looked at her steadily. "I mention it only because you are new here and need to know who is reliable. Nothing more." Matilda smiled despite herself. "Of course," she said. She was at the livery at 2 o'clock exactly. Clement was already there with both horses saddled, and he handed her Biscuit's reins without comment. They rode south out of town on the wagon road, and then turned off onto a narrower track that wound through cedar and live oak and occasional limestone outcroppings that caught the afternoon light and turned gold. The hill country in spring was genuinely beautiful, Matilda thought, in a spare and rugged way that suited her. Clement rode with the easy competence of someone who had spent years in the saddle, and he did not attempt to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation, which was another thing she appreciated about him. When he did speak, it was to point out something relevant: the draw where the creek had shifted its course over the past decade, the fence line that crosses cattle hands had erected, which sat approximately 40 feet inside her boundary, the condition of the small homestead house, which was still standing but would need work. The house was a low structure of limestone and cedar, 2 rooms, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that looked south toward a small meadow where the grass was coming in green after the winter. It needed a new roof on the north side, and the door had swollen in its frame from moisture and would need to be planed down, and the well would need to be checked, but the walls were sound and the floor was solid wood that had not rotted. Matilda stood in the middle of it and felt something settle in her chest, not peace exactly, not yet, but the outline of peace, like a shape she could see approaching from a long way off. "It is a good house," Clement said from the doorway. He had not come inside, waiting to be invited without making a thing of it. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside and looked around with the same careful assessment he seemed to apply to everything. "Your father built it with good materials. The limestone will hold for 100 years if the mortar is maintained. How far across is cattle from here right now?" "About a mile south. He is using that pasture for his spring grazing. Once you have stock on this land yourself, he will have no claim to it whatsoever, and I will make that plain to him personally if he gives you any difficulty." "I appreciate that," she said, "but I would like to speak to him myself first." He looked at her with something she could not quite read, not skepticism, more like recognition. "All right," he said, "tomorrow morning if you like. His main house is about 4 miles southeast." She nodded. She ran her hand along the limestone wall of her father's house and thought about the man who had built it and never lived in it, who had died in Missouri in a boarding house bed, coughing through his last winter with nothing to show for his years of wandering except this piece of land he had never managed to turn into a home. She was going to do what he had not. She was going to make this place into something real. "Thank you for showing me the property," she said, and her voice was steady. "I should get back to Mrs. Holden's and start making a list of what I need." They rode back toward town in the golden late afternoon light, and the cedars threw long shadows across the trail, and a mockingbird in the live oak above the creek sang about 17 different things in quick succession. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence had a comfortable quality to it that Matilda noticed without meaning to. Harlan Cross turned out to be a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a genuinely red face and small eyes that he compensated for by being very loud. He had 3 cowhands with him when Matilda and Clement rode up to his ranch yard the following morning, and he came off his porch with the aggressive good cheer of a man who assumed he was going to get what he wanted. The conversation lasted approximately 20 minutes. Matilda produced her deed and her registry stamp and laid out the boundary situation with the clarity of someone who had spent the previous evening studying the original survey maps that Bernard Keel had provided her. Cross blustered and referenced his letters from his San Antonio lawyer, and Clement stood just behind Matilda's right shoulder without saying a word, which turned out to be more effective than anything he could have said. His presence was a kind of statement all by itself, calm and certain, and carrying the weight of a man who had been a deputy long enough to know exactly what was and was not legal. In the end, Cross agreed to move his cattle off her southern pasture within a week. "That was well done," Clement said as they rode away. There was genuine respect in his voice. "I had the law on my side," Matilda said. "That is the only thing that matters in a situation like that." "The law on your side helps considerably," he agreed. "But not everyone presents it the way you did." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the road ahead, but there was a slight curve to his mouth that was not quite a smile but was headed in that direction. She looked away again quickly and told herself there was no reason for the warmth that had moved through her chest just then. Over the following weeks, Matilda set about the enormous work of making the homestead livable and productive. She moved out of Mrs. Holden's boarding house and into the stone cottage after she had cleaned it thoroughly, fixed the roof with the help of 2 young men she hired from town, and planed the swollen door down to a proper fit. She bought 2 goats, a dozen chickens, and a small milk cow named Patience, and she established them in the lean-to shed behind the house that she reinforced with cedar posts. She planted a kitchen garden along the south wall where the limestone caught the sun, and she began the longer project of fencing the property boundaries properly. Clement rode out twice in those first weeks, once to help her reset the fence posts along the disputed southern line and once to look at the well, which turned out to need only minor cleaning and was otherwise perfectly functional. He worked alongside her without any self-consciousness about it. He was not the kind of man who performed helpfulness for an audience, she noticed. He simply saw what needed doing and did it. On the second visit, they had their first real conversation that was not entirely practical. They were sitting on the porch in the early evening after a long afternoon of fence work, and Matilda had brought out 2 cups of coffee because it was the least she could do, and the hill country was doing its extraordinary evening thing where the light turned everything amber and gold and the air cooled rapidly off the limestone. Clement was quiet for a long time, watching the meadow. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked finally. He meant the story of the drifters on the road from Abilene, which Pete Arroyo had apparently told everyone in Dusty Creek within 24 hours of her arrival. "My father taught me," she said. "He was not much of a farmer, but he was an excellent shot. He said that a woman who could not shoot in this country was at a permanent disadvantage, and he was right." "He was right," Clement agreed. "You grew up in Missouri." "Yes. Came west when I was 14 when my father got the wandering urge that he never managed to cure. We went to Kansas and then Colorado, and then he sent me back east to my aunt in Missouri when I was 17 to finish my schooling. He said he would send for me when he had the homestead built." She paused. "He never quite managed to build it." There was a gentleness in Clement's silence that was more considerate than most people's words. "I am sorry," he said. "He was a good man," she said. "He was just not a man who could stay still. I think the land here would have made him happy if he had let it." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "What about you? Agnes Drummond told me you came from Fort Worth." He was quiet for a moment that was slightly different from his usual thoughtful quiet, more careful, she thought. "I was a deputy there for 6 years, he said. "I was good at it, I think. But there was a situation involving a man I trusted who turned out to be involved in something I should have seen sooner. People were hurt because I did not see it in time." He said it simply, without drama, but she could hear the weight of it. "I resigned. I came here because I needed somewhere quieter and this land came available." "Do you regret leaving Fort Worth?" she asked. He considered it honestly, which she had already come to understand was what he always did. He did not give reflexive answers. "No," he said finally. "I regret what happened there. I do not regret leaving." He looked out at the meadow. "I like it here. The hills remind me that there are things older than whatever trouble is current." She understood that completely. It was, she thought, exactly the right way to feel about a landscape. He left before dark, as he always did, and she stood on the porch and watched him ride east toward his own property until the cedars closed around him, and the sound of the hoofbeats faded into the evening, and she noticed that the evening was slightly less complete after he had gone. She did not say anything about this to anyone, including herself. June arrived with a heat that Matilda had not fully prepared for, the Texas Hill Country summer bearing down in a way that the Missouri summers of her childhood had not approximated. She learned to work in the early morning and the late afternoon and to let the midday hours go to the goats, who were perfectly philosophical about the heat, and to the kitchen, and to the letters she was beginning to write to agricultural suppliers in San Antonio about seed stock and fencing materials. It was in June that she first had trouble with the men. There were two of them, and they were not from Dusty Creek. They were the kind of drifters that the frontier produced in quantity, not especially dangerous by reputation, but opportunistic, and a woman alone on a homestead 40 acres from town was an opportunity they apparently could not resist investigating. They showed up on a Tuesday morning, rode into her yard without invitation, and began asking questions about whether she was the woman who owned this land, and whether she was looking for help managing it, and whether she might consider a partnership arrangement. The questions were not stated directly. They were stated in the way that such questions always were, with a coating of pleasantness that barely covered what was actually being implied, and Matilda stood on her porch with her rifle in the crook of her arm, and told them that she was not looking for partners, that the land was hers and properly registered, that she had no further use for this conversation, and that they could leave the way they came. The taller of the two looked at the rifle and then at her face and seemed to make a calculation. Then he smiled with the side of his mouth that was not honest and said that they would be seeing her around. They rode off, and Matilda went inside and felt, for the first time since she had arrived in Dusty Creek, genuinely unsettled. She was not afraid, exactly. She had been handling men like that since she was old enough to understand what they were, but she was alone, and the nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and the town was 3 miles up the road. She was considering the situation when she heard hoofbeats and looked out the window to see Clement coming up the track. He had no particular reason to be there that day. They had not arranged a visit, but she would learn later that he had seen the two drifters on the road out of town and had recognized the direction they were headed with the particular instinct of a man who had spent 6 years as a law officer. She told him what had happened, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of water because the day was too hot for coffee. He listened without interrupting. "I know the type," he said. "They are probably heading on through, but I would not rely on that." He paused. "I could ask Pete Arroyo's eldest boy to come stay in the shed for the next week or so. He is 17 and handy and could use the work. It would give you another pair of eyes without changing how you operate the place." It was a practical suggestion, and she appreciated that it did not imply she was incapable of managing her own security. "That would be useful," she said. "Thank you." He started to say something else and then stopped. She looked at him and saw that he was looking at her with an expression that was more open than his usual careful reserve. And for a moment, there was something between them that was quite clear, even though neither of them addressed it directly. "You should not be out here entirely alone," he said, and his voice had a quality to it that she had not heard before, something quieter and more direct than his usual measured tone. "Not because you are not capable, you clearly are, but because this is a difficult place and difficult times, and even capable people need someone who is paying attention." She held his gaze for a moment. "Are you offering to pay attention?" She asked, and she kept her voice level, but she could hear something in it that she had not meant to put there. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but close. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I am." He left in the early afternoon, and the day felt different after that, brighter along certain edges, more defined in its distances. She stood in her kitchen garden and turned this feeling over in her hands like an interesting stone, examining it from various angles, and concluded that it was real and significant and that she was going to be careful with it. The drifters did not come back. Pete's boy, whose name was Miguel and who was in fact 19 and not 17, came to stay in the shed for 2 weeks and helped with the fencing and the garden, and proved to have an excellent way with the goats. And when the situation felt settled, He went back to town, and Matilda gave him a week's wages and a jar of the honey she had traded from a neighbor named Ezra Cobb who kept bees along the south hillside. Clement came by twice more in June, and both times they ended up sitting on the porch in the evening, talking about things that had little to do with land boundaries or property rights. She told him about her education in Missouri, the 2 years she had spent at a small school for young women in St. Louis, where she had learned Latin and botany and arithmetic, and a good deal more practical knowledge than she had expected. He told her about growing up in rural Kentucky, the youngest of 5 brothers, learning to ride before he could properly walk, coming west at 18 because Kentucky had felt like it was running out of room. She told him about her mother, who had died when Matilda was 11, a quick fever that had taken her in 3 days and left a gap in the household that her father had never quite known how to fill. He told her about the woman he had once thought he would marry in Fort Worth, a schoolteacher named Frances who had ultimately chosen a safer kind of life with a man who ran a dry goods business and came home at the same hour every evening. "Do you regret that?" she asked, the way she had asked about Fort Worth. He thought about it in his honest way. "I regret that it did not work," he said, "but I think we were not well suited. I think she needed something I could not give her, which was certainty. I have never been very certain about the future. I am only certain about the present." Matilda thought about this for a long while after he had gone. She was, she realized, quite the opposite. She had always planned toward the future, always constructed her life in terms of what she was building toward rather than what was directly around her. This 40 acres was a project, a future she was constructing out of limestone and cedar and hard work and stubbornness. But she was finding, sitting on this porch in these evenings, that the present had a quality she had been somewhat neglecting. July arrived with a thunderstorm that came down off the high country in the middle of the night and knocked a large branch off the live oak that shaded the east side of the house, and the branch took a section of the shed roof with it and frightened the goats into a considerable uproar. Matilda was out in the rain at 3 in the morning in her coat, moving the goats to the lean-to on the house's west side, which was more sheltered, talking to them in the low, steady voice that animals responded to, getting soaked to the skin in the warm summer rain. By morning the storm had passed and left behind it the extraordinary washed clarity that followed hill country thunderstorms, every leaf and rock shining, the creek audible from twice its normal distance. She assessed the damage and found it less serious than it had seemed in the dark. The shed needed roof repair on one corner and some new planking, but the structure was sound. She was halfway through fixing the shed when Clement rode up, and she heard him stop his horse and stand looking at the damage for a moment before he dismounted and came to where she was working. "I saw the storm last night from my place," he said. "The lightning looked like it hit near here." "Branch fell," she said. "I have the worst of it cleared. The roof needs planking." "I have planking in my wagon," he said. "I brought it in case." She stopped working and looked at him, and something in the fact of this, that he had loaded planking into his wagon and ridden over in the early morning because he had seen the storm and been concerned about her, moved through her in a way that was entirely different from anything she had felt in a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily, but her eyes stung briefly with something that was not quite tears. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out slightly rougher than she intended. He looked at her steadily for a moment, and then he said, quietly, "Matilda." It was the first time he had used her given name. She had been Miss Finley to him for all the weeks since she had arrived, and she had been Miss Finley to everyone in Dusty Creek, and the sound of her own name in his voice was unexpectedly affecting. "Clement," she said. He seemed about to say something more, but instead he turned and went to get the planking from his wagon, and she went back to what she had been doing, and they worked side by side all morning with a quality to the air between them that had been unnamed before and was now, if still unnamed, at least acknowledged. They had lunch on the porch. She had bread and cold salt pork and the first tomatoes from her kitchen garden, which were good, and afterward they sat in the companionable afternoon shade. And eventually Clement said, "I would like to take you to the dance in town next Saturday, if you would be willing." The town held a dance the second Saturday of every month in the summer, in the open yard behind the saloon, with a fiddle player named Old Sam Kittredge, and sometimes a second musician from one of the outlying ranches. Matilda had not yet attended one. She looked at the tomato plant climbing its cedar stake and thought about being a woman who was careful and a woman who was honest, and decided that both of those things led in the same direction. "I would be willing," she said. He looked at her with that careful expression that she had come to understand held considerably more warmth than it showed on the surface. "Good," he said. "I will come at 7. The Saturday dance was the sort of event that a small frontier town made into something larger than it was by the simple fact of everyone being there, and being glad of it. Matilda wore her green dress that was not quite suitable for the occasion, being slightly too formal, and then decided it was perfectly suitable because it was the best dress she had, and this was a significant occasion. She pinned her dark hair up with the 2 tortoiseshell pins that had been her mother's, and decided she was ready. Clement arrived at 7 exactly, on his bay horse, and he had clearly made some effort in his own presentation. His shirt was clean and pressed, and he was wearing a jacket that did not belong to the category of working clothes. He looked at her on the porch, and the open expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen him, and she felt the warmth of it from several feet away. "You look lovely," he said, and said it simply, without decoration. "You look considerably less dusty than usual," she said, and he laughed, which was a sound she realized she had not heard from him before, genuine and unguarded and entirely pleasant. They rode to town together in the long summer evening, the sky going from blue to green to gold along the western hills, the first stars appearing in the east. The dance was already underway when they arrived, Old Sam Kittredge playing a reel with fierce determination, and a dozen couples moving through the pattern on the packed earth. Pete Arroyo was presiding over a table of refreshments, and Agnes Drummond was there with her husband, and Bernard Keel from the land office, and a dozen people that Matilda had come to know in the months since her arrival. She danced the first dance with Clement, and he danced with the competent efficiency of a man who had learned, because it was expected but had not particularly resented the learning, and they managed the figures without difficulty. Then she danced with Bernard Keel, who was surprisingly agile for a desk man, and with Pete Arroyo's eldest son Eduardo, and with a rancher from the North Hills named Patrick Sweeney, who told her at length about his prize bull. Between dances, she found herself beside Agnes Drummond, and Agnes said with the directness that she had come to appreciate, "He has not taken his eyes off you all evening." Matilda did not pretend she did not know who Agnes meant. She looked across the yard and found that this was, in fact, accurate. Clement was standing with Patrick Sweeney, apparently attending to whatever Patrick was saying about the prize bull, but his eyes kept returning to her with a steadiness that made her feel entirely visible in the best possible way. "Agnes," she said, "do you think it is possible to know a person well enough, in 4 months, to understand what they are genuinely like?" "Some people you can know in an afternoon," Agnes said. "Some people you can be married to for 20 years and find new corners in them. It depends on the people, not the time." Later, when Old Sam had taken a break and the yard had settled into quieter conversation, Clement found her at the edge of the gathering, and they walked a little way down the main street in the warm dark, past the closed general store, past the post office, past the church where a single lamp burned behind the window. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think you appreciate plainness." "I do," she said. "I have been thinking about you since the night you walked into me at the Red Kettle," he said, "which was, objectively, the least romantic introduction 2 people have ever had. And I have spent the last 4 months finding reasons to ride out to Crane Creek, and I want you to know that the reasons were real. The fence posts were genuinely misaligned, and the well did genuinely need cleaning, but they were also pretexts. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I admire you considerably. I admire how you came here and set about building your life without asking anyone's permission. I admire the way you thought about Cross and the way you handled those drifters and the way you fixed your own shed in the rain at 3 in the morning." He paused. "I would like, very much, to spend more time with you, in a way that is acknowledged rather than circumstantial." Matilda looked at him in the dark, at his honest face and the careful hope in it, and felt everything she had been turning over and examining since June align itself into something clear and uncomplicated. "I think," she said, "that I have been thinking about you since that night at the Red Kettle as well, even though you are correct that it was not a particularly romantic beginning. Can we agree it was memorable at least?" he said, and the amusement in his voice was warm. "It was very memorable," she said. He held out his hand, and she took it, and they stood there on the main street of Dusty Creek in the warm August dark for a long, quiet moment, and then they walked back to the dance together, still hand in hand, and Agnes Drummond saw them coming and smiled the smile of a woman who is very rarely wrong about things. What followed was the sweetest progression of Matilda's adult life. They were together in a way that the town recognized and respected without making too much of. This was, after all, a community of practical people who had come west for their own good reasons, and who generally understood that people found each other when and how they could. Clement came to Crane Creek 2 or 3 evenings a week, and sometimes on weekend days they rode together into the hills, to the limestone bluffs above the valley, where you could see 10 miles in every direction, and the world looked like a painting of itself. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the loneliness of her mother's death and the specific grief of watching her father slowly fail to become the man he had hoped to be. About the years in Missouri with her aunt who had been kind but not warm, who had given Matilda an education and a room, but had not given her a home in the way that the word actually meant. About the day she had received her father's letter from his Missouri boarding house, dictated to a neighbor because his hands were too weak to hold a pen, telling her about the land in Texas and what he wanted her to do with it. He told her things in return, about his 5 brothers in Kentucky, 2 of whom he still corresponded with, and 3 of whom had scattered into the West in silence. About the specific thing that had happened in Fort Worth, a sheriff who had been taking money from a cattle operation that was branding other men's stock, and Clement's belated understanding of it, and the violent resolution that had left 2 men dead, who might have lived if he had put the evidence together sooner. He carried this quietly, the way the kind of person who holds themselves to account always carries their failings, and she understood the shape of it because she had her own catalog of things she wished she had done differently. "You did not cause those deaths," she said one evening on the limestone bluff, watching the sun go down behind the western hills. "I did not prevent them," he said. "Prevention requires knowledge you did not have," she said. "You cannot hold yourself to account for not knowing what you did not know." He looked at her with that open quality that he had increasingly with her and said, "You are very clear-eyed." "I was trained to be honest," she said. "My father was not much of a provider, but he was a man of considerable personal honesty. It was, I think, the best thing he gave me." Clement reached out and took her hand where it rested on the warm limestone. He did not say anything, but he turned his face toward the sunset and kept hold of her hand, and the evening light made everything amber, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was in love with this man. She had not said it yet, and he had not said it yet, and they were both people who did not use words lightly, who understood the weight of what something said plainly could not be taken back. But the knowledge was there between them now, visible and real, like the landscape in the clear morning air after rain. In September, Harlan Cross attempted a final run at the property line dispute. He had apparently been in contact with his San Antonio lawyer again, and the lawyer had found a possible challenge in the language of the original 1868 survey regarding the creek boundary, arguing that the shift in Crane Creek's course had moved the recognized southern edge of Matilda's property. It was, Bernard Keel told her, a weak argument but not a completely baseless one, and it would require a response. Matilda spent 3 days with the original survey maps and her father's correspondence and the creek records from the county, which she requested from the county seat at considerable logistical difficulty, and she assembled an argument that she then presented in writing to Bernard Keel, who sent it on to the County Land Commission. Clement helped her draft the letter, sitting at her kitchen table late one evening with a lamp between them, his handwriting across the top of the document neat and precise where her own draft had grown cramped with the effort of being entirely accurate. It was a strange and intimate thing, sharing a table like that for a serious purpose, their heads sometimes close as they bent over the same document. At one point she said something about the exact language of the creek boundary clause, and he leaned forward to look at the passage she was indicating, and his shoulder was against hers, and neither of them moved away. "This argument will hold," he said about the letter. "It is correct," she said. "It should hold." "Being correct and prevailing are not always the same thing," he said, "but in this case I believe they will be." He was right. The County Land Commission upheld her boundaries in their ruling 3 weeks later. The creek shift did not alter the recorded legal boundary, which was fixed by the survey markers and not by the creek's natural course. Cross received the ruling without grace but without further challenge, and the question of her southern pasture was closed. Matilda took the formal ruling document from Bernard Keel and walked home through the early October afternoon, through the live oaks that were beginning to think about their brief autumn color, and she held the document in her hands and thought about her father, who had bought this land and never managed to hold it, and about herself, who had come here with a rifle and a carpetbag and the stubbornness of someone who has nothing left to lose, and who was turning 40 acres of Texas hill country into a home. She went home and she planted the last of her autumn garlic, and she fed her chickens and her goats and checked on Patience the cow, and when Clement rode up in the late afternoon, she was standing in her kitchen garden with dirt on her hands, and she told him about the ruling, and he smiled the full, uncomplicated smile that she had come to understand was his real one, the one he reserved for things that genuinely delighted him. "That is excellent news," he said. "It is," she said. She looked at him in the autumn afternoon light, with the cedars going dark against the gold sky. "Clement." Something in her voice told him this was the beginning of something important. He dismounted and came to stand properly in front of her. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything important, directly and without decoration, looking at him with the clarity that her father had trained into her. "I have been certain of it for some time. I wanted to say it plainly." He stood very still for a moment. The late light caught the edge of his face, and he looked more open than she had ever seen him, all the careful reserve gone, and she could see exactly what was behind it. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you that, and I think I have been waiting for a moment worthy of the feeling, which is probably not how it works." "It is definitely not how it works," she said. And then she laughed, and he laughed, and he stepped forward and took both her dirty hands in his clean ones, not caring at all about the garden soil, and they stood in the kitchen garden in the October light and looked at each other with the uncomplicated happiness of two people who have arrived at the same place at the same time. He kissed her that evening, on the porch in the cool October dusk, and it was the sort of kiss that neither of them rushed because there was nothing waiting on the other side of it that was more important than it was. Afterwards she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the first star appear in the east over the dark hills, and the night was very quiet and very large around them, and she thought that this was what peace felt like, the full version of it rather than the outline. October went forward with the particular richness of a Texas hill country autumn, the sumac turning red along the draws, the live oaks dropping their acorns, the deer coming down into the lower meadows in the cool mornings. Matilda's 40 acres were, by autumn, genuinely productive in the ways she had planned. The kitchen garden had yielded better than she had hoped. The chickens were laying reliably. The goats were contributing to a small but real supply of cheese that she was selling to the general store at reasonable terms. And she had acquired 3 additional acres by purchasing an adjacent strip from an elderly man named Josiah Carmichael, who was consolidating his holdings before retiring to live with his daughter in Careville. Clement proposed to her on a Saturday in November. He had not prepared a long speech. She would not have wanted one, and he would not have been comfortable delivering one. They were walking along the bluff above the creek in the early afternoon, the day clear and cold, the cedars a deep green against the pale winter sky, and he stopped and turned to her and said, "I want to marry you, Matilda. I want to build a life here with you on your land and on mine, and I want to do it honestly and properly. Will you marry me?" She did not deliberate in the way she sometimes did about large decisions. The answer was available immediately, clear and solid. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He had a ring that had been his mother's, a small gold band with a garnet that was modest and beautiful and suited her exactly, and he put it on her hand there on the limestone bluff above Crane Creek, and the cold wind came down off the hills, and the cedar trees stood dark and quiet around them, and the world felt precisely as full as it was. They were married in December, in the small church in Dusty Creek, by the pastor who came through from the county seat on the first Sunday of each month. The ceremony was in the morning, quiet and attended by perhaps 30 people, which was most of the town. Agnes Drummond was there in her good dress, and Pete and Carmen Arroyo, and Bernard Keel, who cried very slightly and pretended he had dust in his eye. Old Sam Kittredge played the fiddle at the reception, which was held in the saloon because it was too cold for the yard, and Carmen Arroyo had made a wedding cake of a complexity and beauty that seemed almost impossibly ambitious for a frontier kitchen, and was delicious. Matilda wore her green dress and her mother's tortoiseshell pins, and Clement wore his best suit, and they stood in front of the simple altar of the stone church, and made their promises in the clear winter light that came through the single south window. And she held his hand and felt the gold ring on her finger and thought about all the roads that had brought her here, to this cold church in this small town, to this man. She thought about her father, who had wanted her to have this land and this life. She thought about her mother, who she had missed for 13 years. She thought about the girl she had been in Missouri, studying Latin and botany and learning to be precise and honest and self-sufficient, not knowing what she was preparing for. She thought about the woman she had become, stepping off a stagecoach in Dusty Creek with a rifle and a carpetbag and a determination that had not yet found its proper direction, and she understood that this was how lives were actually built, not by grand plans but by choices made one at a time, plainly and honestly in the actual present. The winter was cold and productive. They combined what needed combining, his 40 eastern acres and her 43, his small herd of cattle with her goats and chickens and cow, his supplies and equipment with hers, the whole thing requiring considerable logistics that they worked out on paper at her kitchen table on many evenings, which had become the center of their shared life. They decided to base their operation at her homestead, because the house was better situated relative to the water and the southern pasture, and Clement's smaller house on the eastern property became a secondary structure that they used for storage and planned eventually to expand into a proper barn. He brought to the partnership a cattle sense that she lacked, and she brought to it a methodical precision about records and planning that he admired genuinely. They were not in competition with each other, and never had been, which was, she thought, the most important thing about them as a pair. They were building the same thing. Spring came early and with it the second planting season, and Matilda expanded the kitchen garden considerably, adding the south meadow strip she had always planned to put into cultivation. Clement took on 2 contracted cattle drives in the spring that brought in real income, and established them, as a reliable operation in the county. They hired Miguel Arroyo part-time through the spring season, and a young man from the hill country to the north named Abel Reyes, who was 20 years old and an extraordinary horseman, and proved useful in more ways than they had anticipated. In March, Matilda told Clement she was pregnant. They were at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp between them, the March wind coming under the door with the smell of rain, and she told him and watched the expression on his face move from attention to understanding to something so full and unguarded that she had to look at the table for a moment because it was almost too much to look directly at. "Matilda," he said. His voice was very quiet. "In September, I think," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she looked up, and his face was entirely open, entirely present, the most completely happy she had ever seen him. "I am so glad," he said. And then quietly, "I have been hoping." "So have I," she said. The spring and summer of 1879 were by any reasonable measure the best period of Matilda's life to that point. She was strong and well through the pregnancy, which did not slow her down as much as people suggested it might. She modified what she did, but continued working the garden and managing the household and helping with the lighter cattle work through July. Clement was attentive in a way that was practical rather than anxious, which was what she needed. He noticed what was actually difficult and helped with those things without treating her as though she had become fragile. They talked about names. She liked the name William if it was a boy, for her maternal grandfather who had been a steady and reliable man. He liked the name Emmett for no particular reason except that it had a solid sound. They agreed, after some consideration, that either was good. She also began, in the summer, to teach herself more about the medicinal herbs of the hill country, with the help of a woman named Consuela Reyes, Abel's grandmother, who had lived in the hills for 30 years and knew the plants with an intimacy that came from necessity and tradition. Consuela was a small woman of perhaps 65 with hands that showed the work of decades and an intelligence that went sideways and practical, finding solutions in directions that straightforward thinking missed. She and Matilda took to each other immediately. Consuela told her about the plants as they walked the hillsides, the herbs and roots and barks that addressed fever and digestive trouble and wound care, the knowledge that had kept her family and her community healthy in a place where doctors were rare. Matilda wrote everything down in a small notebook, and in return she shared the food from her garden and her reading, because Consuela's grandchildren were learning their letters and she wanted them to have more to practice with. In these long summer evenings, Matilda sometimes thought about how different this life was from anything she had imagined when she was a girl in Missouri, or a young woman studying Latin, or even a woman of 24 stepping off a stagecoach into a new place. She had imagined various futures, and none of them had looked like this, like limestone walls and cedar posts, and a garden full of garlic and a milk cow named Patience, and a man who looked at her the way Clement looked at her, and an autumn child growing and the hill country turning all around her into something permanent and hers. It was better than anything she had imagined. That was the surprising thing. The baby was born in September, on a cool early morning after a night of labor that Consuela attended and managed with the confident efficiency of a woman who had attended many births. He was a boy, and he was healthy, and he came into the world hollering, which Clement said was a good sign. They named him William Emmett Donovan, a compromise that satisfied everyone, and he was from the first an extremely determined small person with dark eyes like his father and his mother's habit of regarding everything with careful attention before reacting to it. Clement held him that first morning with the particular tenderness of a large and generally self-sufficient person confronted with something entirely new and entirely trusting, and Matilda watched from the bed where Consuela had finally made her rest, and the feeling in her chest was so vast and complicated that she could not have named all its components. Love was in there, and gratitude, and something that was not quite awe but was adjacent to it. "Hello, William," Clement said very quietly to the baby in his arms. William looked at him with his dark new eyes and seemed to be deciding something. "He is considering whether you are trustworthy," Matilda said. "I hope he concludes that I am," Clement said, still in that quiet voice that was entirely new from him and entirely natural. "He will," she said. "He has good judgment. He gets it from his mother." Clement looked up at her over the baby's head with the real smile, the full one, and she smiled back, and Consuela bustled through from the kitchen with broth and told them both to stop being ridiculous and let the woman rest. The autumn of 1879 settled around them like a good coat, warm, reliable, earned. William grew with the speed that healthy babies grew, and the homestead continued its own steady growth. Clement had taken on the informal deputy role more formally, as the county worked toward appointing a new sheriff, and while he was careful about how much time it took from the land and from the family, he was good at it, and Matilda was glad of it because the county needed someone reliable. He talked with her about everything significant, not in a way that suggested he needed her permission, but in the way of a person who genuinely wanted the perspective of someone whose opinion he respected. She did the same. This was, she thought, what a real partnership was, not two people who had merged into one entity, but two people who remained distinct and chose, repeatedly, to build something together. Old Sam Kittredge died in October, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, and Dusty Creek held a proper funeral that half the county attended because Old Sam had played at every wedding and dance and Christmas gathering for 2 decades, and the grief was real. Matilda stood in the church with William in her arms and Clement beside her, and thought about the old man's music, which had been the soundtrack to the night she had first arrived at the dance with Clement, and which would always have a specific color in her memory. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was mild, and they got through it without serious difficulty. William began to develop opinions about things, which expressed themselves primarily in facial expressions at first and then gradually in sounds, and then one morning in February in his first real word, which was directed at the goats from the porch, and was something that sounded very much like a deliberate comment. "What did he just say?" Clement said. "I believe he was addressing the goats," Matilda said. "He has strong feelings about them. He gets that from his mother as well, I suppose." "Actually, he gets it from you," she said. "You talk to the cattle constantly and think I do not notice." He laughed and picked William up from the porch, and the goats, who had been watching with their unsettling sideways attention, lost interest and went back to their grass. Spring came again, and with it, the second planting and the beginning of the new projects. They were expanding the main house, adding a room to the north side that would serve as a proper bedroom for William as he grew, and extending the garden to the east along the slope that Matilda had been preparing with winter compost. Clement had taken on a formal 2-year deputy appointment from the county, which came with a small regular income that went directly into the fund they were building for the house expansion. They were, by the spring of 1880, 2 years into their marriage, and it was better in the second year than in the first, which Matilda had been told by Agnes Drummond was not always the case, but was the right outcome when two people were genuinely suited. The specific quality of being with Clement, the ease of it, the way his presence was comfortable without being dull, the way they could disagree about something practical and reach a resolution without damage, was something she had not expected to find and was grateful for every day. There were hard things too, because life in the hill country in 1880 was genuinely hard in ways that did not disappear because you were happy. The summer of 1880 brought a drought that lasted 2 months and stressed the garden and the pasture, and required careful management of the well and the creek flow. There was a livestock illness that moved through the county in the spring that took one of her goats and required careful separation of the others for 3 weeks. There was the ongoing reality of isolation. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away, the county infrastructure was minimal, and the work of maintaining a homestead was relentless in a way that fair weather and good harvests could disguise but not eliminate. But these were the difficulties of a life being lived, not the difficulties of a life going wrong. There was a difference, and Matilda understood it. She wrote a letter to her father's grave in Missouri, once, sitting at the kitchen table on a quiet afternoon while William slept, and the October light came sideways through the window. She wrote about the land, what it looked like in autumn with the sumac red and the limestone gold, and about the house that was now properly theirs, and about William who had his grandfather's dark eyes and would, she hoped, have the best of his qualities without the wandering. She wrote about Clement and what he was like, and how much she wished her father had known him. She wrote at the end that she was happy, that the land was exactly what he had hoped it would be, that she was making it into a home. Then she folded the letter and kept it in the desk, because there was nowhere to send it, but writing it had been the right thing to do. By the autumn of 1880, Matilda was pregnant again. She told Clement on the porch one evening, William asleep inside, the stars coming out over the hill country in their profligate autumn abundance. He took the news with the same fullness as the first time, and then he held her hand and they sat in the quiet for a long time, listening to the creek and the nighthawk, and the world was large and dark and full of stars around them. This child arrived in May, which was a gentler time for a birth than September had been, the spring air soft and the garden in full early growth. This baby was a girl, born just before dawn on a morning when the hill country was in full spring bloom, the bluebonnet still covering the south meadow in purple blue, the birds beginning their morning singing as she came into the world. They named her Ruth Finley Donovan, for Matilda's mother whose middle name had been Ruth, and Finley to carry forward the name of the man who had bought this land and dreamed of it, and left it for his daughter to complete what he had only begun. William, who was now 18 months old and had developed very definite opinions about almost everything, examined his new sister with the careful assessment that he brought to everything important, and then appeared to decide she was acceptable. "He approves," Clement said. "He is reserving judgment," Matilda said, "like his father." "His father approved of you immediately," Clement said. "He was just careful about showing it." She looked at him across the baby in her arms and smiled the smile that she reserved for him, the particular one that she had never used for anyone else before and would never use for anyone else after. "I know," she said. "I was paying attention." The years settled into their rhythm. William grew from a determined toddler into a determined small boy who asked questions about everything, and had a natural affinity for animals that expressed itself first in his relationship with the goats, and then with the cattle, trailing after his father on the range with the concentrated attention of someone learning a thing they intend to keep. Ruth was quieter than her brother, more given to sitting in the kitchen garden in the late afternoons watching the bees and the hummingbirds that came to the salvias along the east wall. But her quietness was not the quietness of absence. It was the quietness of a person who was taking everything in and would have something specific to say about it later. Matilda continued her work with Consuela Reyes, who had become over the years something between a friend and a mentor and a second grandmother to the children. She had extended her botanical knowledge considerably and had begun, tentatively, to serve as an informal medical resource for the homesteads and small ranches around them, not because there was no other option, but because she was there, and she knew what she was doing and people trusted her. This was not without its complexities. She was careful never to overstate her knowledge or to address situations that genuinely required a doctor. But the practical reality of life 40 miles from medical care in the 1880s Texas Hill Country was that someone had to know what to do about fever and infected wounds and difficult labors and children's ailments, and Matilda made herself that person. Clement observed this with the respect he had always had for her and added to it. "You know," he said one evening, "there is a movement in some of the bigger towns to establish formal positions for women in nursing and public health." "I know," she said. "I am following it." "Does that interest you?" She thought about it honestly. "What I do here interests me," she said. I do not know that I need a formal position to do it, but I believe the work matters whatever its form." He nodded. "The work matters very much," he said. "I have seen what you do for people." There were things she was aware of, living in the hill country, that pressed at the edges of the life she had built. The communities of Tejano families like the Reyes family, who had been on this land longer than any of the Anglo settlers, and who navigated a legal and social landscape that was systematically arranged against their interests. The Apache and Comanche communities further west, whose way of life had been profoundly disrupted by the expansion that had brought Matilda and Clement and everyone else here, a reality that she held with complexity because she was part of it, living on land that had not always been called by any European name. She talked about this with Clement, and with Consuela, and with Agnes Drummond, who had lived it longer and thought about it more. There were no easy answers, there rarely were, but she believed in holding the complexity honestly rather than looking away from it, and in conducting her own dealings with everyone around her with the fairness that her father had taught her. She was, she thought, building something real. It was an imperfect thing, like all real things, situated in a particular time and place with particular limitations. But it was honest, and it was hers, and it was growing. In the spring of 1883, Matilda turned 29 and Clement turned 35, and Dusty Creek had grown to perhaps 400 souls and had a proper school and a new church building, and 2 additional businesses on the main street. The Donovan homestead on Crane Creek was by now a well-established operation, 43 acres of their own, and another 20 leased from a neighbor who had moved to San Antonio. A proper cattle herd of modest size, the garden and the chickens and the goats, the milk cow patients who had produced 2 calves and was still, improbably, going strong. The house had been expanded twice and had 3 bedrooms now and a proper kitchen, and a covered porch that ran the full length of the south side and looked out over the meadow where the bluebonnets came back every spring. Clement was appointed county sheriff that spring, a formal appointment following 2 years as deputy, and he accepted it with the seriousness it warranted and the understanding that it would require more time away from the land. Matilda calculated what this meant for the operation and made adjustments and was completely supportive, because it was the right role for him, and she was not the kind of woman who resented her husband's competence or standing in the world. They celebrated his appointment on the porch in the evening, with the children in bed and a bottle of wine that Pete Arroyo had ordered specially from a supplier in Austin. It was not excellent wine, but it was decent, and the evening was warm and the stars were out and the meadow was full of the late spring smell of grass and cedar. "Sheriff Donovan," she said. "That is what they will call me," he said with a slight note of wonder. "Does it feel different?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "Ask me in a month." "I will ask you in a month." He reached over and took her hand. "None of this," he said, "is what I expected my life to look like when I was a boy in Kentucky." "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it with the honesty he always brought to questions like this. "Something smaller," he said, "quieter. I am not sure I expected to be happy in the way that I am. I think I expected life to be something to endure rather than something to live." She understood that completely because she had half expected the same thing in the years before Dusty Creek. "I think many people expect that," she said, "and then they are surprised." "Are you surprised?" he asked. She looked at him in the starlight, at this man she had married and built a life with, at the house behind them where their children were sleeping in the rooms they had added, and the land around them that her father had dreamed of and she had made real. She thought about the stagecoach from Abilene and the rifle and the carpetbag and walking into a man's chest in a frontier saloon. "Yes," she said, "every day a little, in the best way." He raised his glass and she raised hers, and they sat in the warm spring dark and listened to the creek running down through the cedars toward the south meadow, and the nighthawks were out in the evening air, and somewhere in the hills a coyote called once and was answered, and the world was ancient and beautiful around the small warm light of the house on Crane Creek. They had many seasons after that. good ones and hard ones and ordinary ones and extraordinary ones. And the children grew toward their own becoming with the particular energy of young people who have been given both roots and room. William at 10 was already the cattle boy his father had recognized in him at 2, patient and perceptive with animals in a way that went beyond learned skill into something native. Ruth at 8 was full of questions about plants and medicines, trailing after her mother in the garden and in the hills with Consuela, making her own small notebooks of observations. In the spring of 1884, their third child arrived, another boy, whom they named James for Matilda's father. He was born in the house they had built and expanded together, delivered by Consuela as his older siblings had been, into the early morning light of a hill country spring. He came into the world looking, Clement said, like a man who had arrived exactly where he had intended to be. Matilda held him in the morning light and thought about the deed she had carried into the land office on her first day in Dusty Creek, and about the rifle and the carpet-bag and the stagecoach from Abilene, and about the evening on the limestone bluff when Clement had said he loved her plainly because she appreciated plainness, and about the winter night when he had asked her to marry him with the cold wind coming off the hills, and about all the seasons between then and now. Her father's 40 acres had become 63. The cottage had become a proper house. The town up the road was growing into something permanent. The children were growing into themselves. And beside her, always, was the man she had walked into on a spring night in 1878 in a frontier saloon, who had stood quietly behind her right shoulder while she settled a property dispute, who had loaded planking into his wagon after a storm because he was paying attention, who had taken her dirty garden hands in his clean ones and not cared at all about the soil. Clement came to the bedside and sat beside her and looked at the new baby and then at her. "James," he said. "James," she agreed. Outside, the hill country was in full spring morning, the bluebonnets covering the south meadow all the way to the creek, the cedar waxwings moving through the live oaks in their bright-eyed dozens, the creek talking to itself over the limestone in the way it had been talking since before any of them were born. The sun was coming up warm and clear over the eastern hills, the hills that Clement had said reminded him that there were things older than whatever trouble was current, and the morning was entirely itself, complete and unhurried. Matilda leaned her head back against the pillow and held her youngest child and felt the full weight and richness of her life, the 43 acres that were 63, the 2 rooms that were 6, the woman who had arrived with nothing much except a rifle and a deed, and the unshakable conviction that she was going to make something real. She had made something real. More than she had planned and better than she had imagined, with a partner beside her who was honest and steady and who looked at her still, with the quality of attention that had first shown itself in a lamplit saloon on a spring night in Texas, 7 years and 3 children and a whole life ago. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Agnes Drummond came by that afternoon with food and her characteristic directness and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with the satisfaction of someone who has been watching things turn out correctly for a long time. "He looks like James Finley," she said, "around the eyes." Matilda looked at her son's face and thought that Agnes was right. "Good," she said. "Your father would have been very proud," Agnes said, "of all of it." Clement was in the kitchen with William and Ruth, the sounds of them coming through the wall, Ruth's precise questions about the baby, William's philosophical acceptance of a new brother, Clement's voice answering them with the patience and warmth that he gave to everything important. Matilda could hear the creek through the open window, and the birds in the live oaks, and the goats making their commentary from the shed. And beyond all of it, the permanent limestone silence of the hill country holding everything in its ancient hands. She was 29 years old, and she had 43 acres and a homestead, and a husband she loved, and 3 children who would grow up knowing this land as their own, and knowing that the women and men who built it had done so with honesty and hard work, and the occasional well-placed rifle shot in the general direction of people who needed redirecting. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The creek ran on. The bluebonnets covered the meadow. The cedar trees stood dark against the sky. And in the house on Crane Creek, in the warm stone house that her father had built and she had made into a home, Matilda Finley Donovan held her son in her arms and was, simply and completely, glad.